Okay, let's call to order the joint meeting of the Personnel and Finance Committees. I guess as Chair of Finance, I'll call to order the Finance Committee meeting for, what's today, June 20th.
And as Chair of Personnel, I will call to order the personnel meeting for June 20th, 2023.
Bill and Brian, would you do the roll call, please?
Nelson.
Here.
Jackson.
Here.
Cole.
Here.
For Finance Committee, Canairo,
Here.
Jackson,
Here.
Lorman,
Here.
and Alder Wilkos is absent and excused this evening.
Okay, great. Thank you. Next, we'll move on to the minutes of the June 6, 2023 Personnel and Finance Committees meeting jointly. May I get a motion from you, Alder Jackson, since you are on both committees, to approve the minutes for both committees?
I make a motion to approve.
I'll second for finance.
I'll second for personnel.
Any discussion or corrections? All right, hearing none, I apologize for forgetting that we don't need to vote, but since we have graciously gotten a motion and a second, all those in favor for approving for finance signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, it passes for finance.
I'll approve for personnel, signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes.
I promise I'll remember that next time. Would you like to bring up the next topic?
Certainly, thank you, Madam Chair. Miscellaneous item number 1, discussion regarding consolidation of the Personnel and Finance Committees into a single committee. This is a discussion only, no action. Do you want to take that, Lisa?
Sure, I will launch the discussion. So one of the recommendations in our strategic plan is, quote, to improve governance efficiency, the number of committees, commissions, and authorities and their functions should be reviewed. And it further goes on to say a consolidation should be considered. In January of this year, actually, I raised this in the Finance Committee meeting as a potential opportunity to follow through on that strategic planning recommendation, because I noted that the Finance Committee always meets, the Personnel Committee sometimes meets, and often when it does, it's in conjunction with the Finance Committee. So this seemed like a good opportunity to combine committees. I checked, and the municipalities of Milwaukee, Monona, Mount Horeb, Cottage Grove, and Dane and Winnebago counties have personnel and finance committees, while our peer cities, Sun Prairie, Fitchburg, Stoughton, McFarland, and Verona, they still have separate committees. I also would note that I noticed our municipal code doesn't really describe the duties of personnel, finance, or the license and ordinance committee. So I just will add that to the list of future things that the L&O committee might want to look at. So I'd love to hear what the other members think. And even though it says discussion only, no action, I'm inclined to suggest that we make a referral to L&O to draft something to then forward back to, or return to this committee so that we can take a look at it jointly and see what we think.
Dave, no?
No comment.
No comment. Jen?
I have some questions as a matter of process. With that, would we need to restructure the composition of the committees, meaning quorum, like council quorum issues, or?
That would be an item we need to take a look at. If the body wanted to remain in the similar membership that it is now, we would also have to notice for every combined, just call it the newly created Personnel Finance Committee, we would have to notice that a sub-quorum of the council may potentially be present at every meeting. That would cover you in the event that you wanted to keep it 5 members, I guess. But as Alder Heniro mentioned, some of the other combined personnel and finance committees have different memberships. When I was in Monona, that was a 3-person group. So there's some options that are available for this body to consider if you want. If it's the same, make it smaller. There's no hard and fast rule.
Because we certainly would need to figure out how to deal with the chair issue, right? Unless you have co-chairs, but
Yeah, and I mean that I have not seen that, to
Okay.
be honest.
And then another question with regard to right, for example, the personnel committee may handle things separately from finance, such as employee issues, right, discipline or termination that might be needed. That would just be absorbed then into the joint committee and,
Correct.
okay.
Yeah, just comment that those are really good questions. And I had thought if this goes forward, that perhaps a 5-person committee could work. But your point about a quorum of council members is a good one. So maybe that's something, all these questions are things that I think LNO would need to discuss and then bring back to us. And regarding your comment about what the personnel matters that might become or might be coming to the personnel committee, again, I was surprised to read in our ordinance that there's really no description of what the purview of any of the standing committees is. I know Public Works is further defined in chapter 2, but there isn't really anything in chapter 1. So I think it's probably on the website, but it doesn't appear unless it's in the personnel chapter.
Yeah, is that on? The Personnel Committee and the Personnel and Finance meeting jointly.
It was on the first time.
The Personnel Committee and the Personnel and Finance Committee meeting jointly. Their roles, responsibilities, and duties are part of Chapter 27, the Personnel Ordinance. They weren't previously articulated anywhere. And so when we revised the ordinance in 2021, I laid out the specific responsibilities for both in the Personnel Ordinance. I would say in the 3 years I've been here, 70 to 75% of the time we have met as a joint finance and personnel committee because the ordinance says that if there is items of any material content that have a finance impact or a material dollar impact, that we meet as a joint finance and personnel committee. That being said, there have been a number of times where we met simply as a personnel committee because they were simply matters of personnel policy without any change or material financial impact. And that's just something for you to consider as you make this decision. Do you want to burden both committees for specific policy issues that don't have a financial impact by permanently joining them, or do you want to continue with the same structure?
Further comments?
I want to just appreciate the effort to sort of streamline and make more efficient our committee time. However, all of these points are really good, and I think I don't know if LNO is going to bring anything to our attention that we wouldn't think of, but I think it's a good idea to send it to them if everyone else is agreeable to that.
Are you making a motion then?
Sure, I'll move that we send along request to LNO to start a draft description of a combined finance and personnel committee. Did I miss anything in the motion?
I think that's maybe a date by which we'd like something back.
Given that I don't see any super urgent
Sure.
timeline, maybe we can give them until the beginning of fall, or is that too soon?
I'm sorry, you said the beginning of,
Like beginning of September, or is that too soon? That's only 2 meetings for them. Maybe we'll give them till October.
Thoughts from the staff?
October 1st is reasonable and, we can try to streamline things as much as possible.
Perfect. Let's do that.
Okay. All right, so the motion is moving referral to, or passing along to LNO, the request to start a draft description of what the combined committee would look like. And to bring that to us by our first meeting in October. I guess it would be October 3rd.
I will second that motion as a member of the LNO committee also. So I look forward to taking this up.
Great.
So
Thank you, Jen.
Nelson makes that motion and Cole seconds for personnel. Jeff, would you like to make a motion? Or Dave?
So I'll make a motion that the LNO review a draft to combine the Personnel and Finance Committees. Have that draft available or finished by the October 3rd
That's when our first meeting is.
meeting. Yes. I second that motion.
Right. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those on finance in favor of the motion to ask LNO to start a draft, to develop a draft description of a combined personnel and finance committee by October 3rd, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it.
Personnel, all in favor of referring this to LNO for a draft description of combined personnel and finance committees, signify by saying aye.
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 Any opposed? Motion passes.
Thank you. Moving on to our last item under miscellaneous, it is review and discussion of the fall 2022 employee benefits survey results. Discussion only, no action. We are pressed for time, so any reactions from members or questions or comments? I would simply note that I noticed that parental leave was the second choice. It was actually worded as maternity leave, and I appreciated the person responding, or maybe it was more than one person who said it should be parental leave, both parental leave. And I wondered how many might have chosen that option if it had said parental instead of maternity. And I would also just ask Brian, why defer action on this particular one for a minimum of 2 years to collect data and not the others? What is it about the 2 years?
The reason that I recommended deferral for this for 2 years is to collect a statistically valid number of cases where we would have paid parental leave, both for female employees that would be out on maternity leave under FMLA and male employees that would be out on parental leave under FMLA or under some other circumstance. We don't have enough of the incidences in a single year to determine a statistical average and narrative that shows what the financial impact would be in implementing this many weeks or this many weeks. Given a 2-year count, I think we would have a significantly valid projection on what that number could be going forward and what that impact would be financially directly and indirectly with deferral of use of vacation and sick time, which is currently used under statutory FMLA parental leave.
Okay. And has the 2 years started, or are you waiting for direction to do this?
I made this recommendation in the fall when we went through this. I got no direction to start counting, so I have not started counting.
Okay. Thank you. I would say, since it says discussion only, no action, I think we'll bring that up at our next joint meeting, or personnel could take it up if personnel meets separately. But I know Mayor Kuhn is very supportive of this. I'm surprised this hasn't been more of an ask, or at least an inquiry from potential new hires, because I just feel like offering I worked for an organization, nonprofit, that had 2 weeks, and I thought that was not good. I thought more would have been much better, of course. Anyway, I see this as, and I see somebody in the room who might have been able to take advantage of this. And so I think it's worth pursuing. I hope that happens. Any other comments or questions for Brian? All right, hearing none, then we'll move on to the next item on the agenda, which is the adjournment of the Personnel Committee. Madam Chair.
I am entertaining motion to adjourn
So moved.
personnel. Do I have a second?
Second the motion, Jackson.
All right, all in favor of adjourning?
Aye.
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 And personnel is adjourned. Thank you.
Great, thank you. All right, carrying on then with the Finance Committee meeting, our first item of business is the minutes of the June 6th Finance Committee meeting, and I'm just going to ask if anyone had any corrections to make. Hearing none, the minutes are approved for the June 6th, 2023 Finance Committee meeting. Next is the audit of the bills to be paid. Bill, do you have any updates for us?
No, there are no updates or additions tonight.
All right, great. Then may I get a motion to approve the audit of the bills?
I shall make that motion to approve an audit of the bills.
All right, I'll second that. Further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the audit of the bills to be paid signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. And Jeff, if you would sign that when you have a chance, put that to Bill. Moving on to bids and quotes, we have 4 items. The first one is award of quote for retaining wall construction for monument sign at the Pleasant View Golf Course. This comes to us from the Golf Committee, the Advisory Committee, and it is specified in our packets that the amount is not to exceed $23,939.45. So may I get a motion to approve the award in that amount?
This is Jackson. I'll make a motion to approve it.
Okay,
Thorman will second.
all right, any discussion?
Subject to attorney legal review. This contract has several significant problems.
Okay, so that's gonna have to be pulled then from the,
No, the council often approves contracts where things still need to be worked out, right? You know, we don't have to delay it. Presumably, if the contractor wants it, they'll make the changes and we'll move forward.
okay. Larry, is one of the things you'll look at the equal benefits clause?
That's an obvious one that's not there. They also have subjecting the city to construction liens under a law that's not applicable to municipalities. Charging 4% if we don't pay by check. There's a number of things, enough to, certainly it's not ready to approve tonight.
Okay, I appreciate that. And I'm wondering, how can we make sure in the future that when contracts like this come to us, they have already gotten your seal of approval?
Well, I don't see them until the packet comes, so
Okay,
certainly they could be sent sooner.
Brian, is that something we can work on in the future?
Yeah, I'll spend some time with staff on it.
Okay, so Alder, Dave, did you move or did Jeff? Did you make the motion? Who
A
moved?
motion, Jeff seconded. Right?
That's okay. I wrote you backwards here. Okay, so
We
are-
want to change the motion.
yes, to say pending city attorney review and and approval.
So I'll make a motion to approve the award to repair or replace the sign for the dollar amount. However, it is pending city attorney review based for the language of that contract.
And you're okay with that change? All right, any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the award of quote for retaining wall construction for monument sign at the Pleasant View Golf Course in an amount not to exceed $23,939.45 pending city attorney review and approval, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Right, the ayes have it. Moving on to item number 2, rejection of bid from staff. Is that correct? From Staff Electric for battery storage at the police station. Is the company, okay. Who would like to move rejection and then we'll start discussion?
I'll move for the rejection of this.
I'll second that. Okay, so we have to formally reject this bid because it's way over our budget, but it exceeds the $25,000 threshold for construction projects under state law. So that's why we can't just not award it. I think this is a really important resiliency project, and I sure would like to see it go forward with a different design. We got the grant in 2020, I believe, and I really would like to see this rebid again in 2023, if that's possible. Does it seem possible, Abby?
I think that is Kelly's intent, is to rebid it this year. We need to get a revised design and then put the packet together. She has requested a revision to the design, which hopefully will take place over the time when she's away from the office, and she expected to be able to load it back into Quest when she's back in the office.
Okay. Great. Any further questions for Abby?
Yeah, I have a question. What was the cause that over budgeted, and were they given clear direction on the budget when they went into it?
I think that because all of our documents with the city are pretty public, that it wouldn't have been too hard for this contractor or any other contractor to know what the city's established budget is. I know that Kelly had noted in her memo that the cost of battery projects has doubled because of supply chain issues and other factors. We also think that there was at least one other contract who had planned to bid until like the night before the bid was due, and contacted city staff and said, can I get an extension? And we said, no, it doesn't work like that. We aren't able to do that. And so we think that there might be other contractors that maybe were really busy with other projects that might be interested in participating. But we are also expecting to have to reduce the overall size of the battery to get it within the budget.
Okay. All right. Well, then if there's no further discussion or questions for Abby, all those in favor of rejecting the bid from Staff Electric for battery storage at the police station signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Next item is award of quote for summer 2023 street tree removal contract. This comes to us from the PRFC, and I would love to get a motion to approve this award in an amount not to exceed $20,550. And before I get that motion, Larry, do you need to see this one?
No, there's no problem on this.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll go ahead and make a motion that we approve the tree removal contract not to exceed $20,550.
I will second that. Any discussion? All right, hearing none. All those in favor of approving the award of quote for summer 2023 street tree removal contract in an amount not to exceed $20,550 signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Our last item under bids and quotes is award of quote for summer 2023 stump grinding contract. And the staff has specified in an amount not to exceed $4,150.
I'll go ahead and first I'll check with Larry. Any
Yes.
questions, concerns on this contract?
Pardon me?
Any problems with
Any
this
problems with
contract?
No.
contract, Larry? Okay, very good. Then I will go ahead and make a motion that we approve the stump grinding contract for $4,150, not to exceed that dollar amount.
Thank you.
This is Jackson. I'll second the motion.
Thank you. Any discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor of approving the award of quote for summer 2023 stump grinding contract in an amount not to exceed $4,150 signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Moving on to miscellaneous, we have two items. The first one is options for funding the city's match of $155,000 for the carbon reduction program grant for conversion of city streetlights to LED. This comes to us from us and council. So we don't need a motion yet. Personally, I'd like to leave the energy efficiency and solar in NOAA project intact if we can. We can't bill all of this to ARPA without making some adjustments. I spoke with Bill Burns this morning in our meeting over the agenda for this meeting. And we talked about possibly moving some of the stormwater projects from the ARPA fund over to the stormwater utility, which is what the utility is for. So Bill, could you comment on that, please?
Yeah, and referring to the memo that's in your packet, Kelly here had laid out three potential options for a starting point for discussion here. But options, all three of these options involve reallocating different funds from the ARPA funding. Option one was reallocating money for solar arrays on wells for well number 6 and well number 8 to the water utility. Option two, which we're discussing, is allocating ARPA funds that were earmarked for the Hidden Oaks Stormwater Improvement Project to this project, and then that would move that to the stormwater utility. And option three was looking at the 2024 allocation for the energy efficiency and NOAA project. I did have an opportunity to check with Eric Sorensen in Public Works today about the stormwater project for Hidden Oaks. His feeling was that that would fall within the scope and the policy that's been set for the stormwater utility. At this point, it does not look like we would be in a position to construct this project in 2023 just due to timing and the other projects that Public Works has going on. So I think one option for the committee and the council would be to allocate a portion of the ARPA funds for the street lighting match, and then consider the Hidden Oak stormwater improvement as a 2024 project within the stormwater utility. I think what we'd be looking for tonight is direction from the Finance Committee and Council, and then based on that direction, we can prepare a resolution for the formal budget amendment, if that's the direction you'd like to go.
Okay, thank you. Any questions for Bill or comments? Hearing none, would someone like to recommend that we, or move that we recommend to council allocating the $155,000 from the Hidden Oaks?
And Madam Chair, I just wanted to provide a point of information to provide some background. When the city was going through the initial process of identifying projects for the use of ARPA funds, we were operating under an initial rule for the federal guidance, which was much more restrictive in the type of projects that those funds could be used for. And things like utility improvements and stormwater projects were part of that smaller eligible category. The final rule has significantly opened that up to almost any public purpose, unless it's specifically excluded in the bill, can be used for ARPA funding. So I think that's why you see some of the things that we do have other funding sources that were included under ARPA originally. We now have flexibility to look at other areas, and so that's part of the discussion of now making this recommendation.
Thank you for that clarification, Bill. Anyone like to make a move that we recommend something to council? I can. If
Yeah, my only really question is really more to the city in terms of priorities. I just, I'm just stepping in here, but I really want to make sure priorities are met in terms of infrastructure, what needs to get done. Obviously, there's a long range plan, and it's certainly the right thing to do by putting in LED lighting from an environmental standpoint and efficiency standpoint. But at the same time, I think we have a core dedication to the city infrastructure, and that we do not neglect the city infrastructure in any way whatsoever. And so that would be my only question to city staff, is that, are we moving funds around and putting something off that absolutely should not be put off in any way whatsoever? That's where I stand. Because one way or another, we'll get LED lights over time. we'll keep writing grants, we'll keep asking for money. There's going to be a lot of incentives out there. So as long as we make some effort in that direction, that's great. But I believe in the foundation of our infrastructure and the importance of it. I don't know if Sean has anything to say or add, but that would be my only note.
And while Sean's taking the podium, I would just make it clear that the suggestion isn't to forego the Hidden Oak stormwater improvements, which is an infrastructure project.
Mhm.
It's just to take $155,000 of the currently allocated ARPA funds for that project and put it on the stormwater utility.
Exactly. But in moving money around like this, are we affecting, important infrastructure that has to get done?
Well, I would say it's important, but the timing is such that I don't think staff time is in a position to take care of it this year anyway. So whether the stormwater utility allocates sufficient funds to take that on then next year, that's its own dedicated funding source for that purpose, specifically so that it doesn't constantly get pushed sideways or deprioritized. Stormwater is its own thing. And in this particular case, staff time became sort of the pinch point. There's a lot of stuff that came up this year that we did not envision last year in setting the budget. And that's sort of the nature of the beast. We have to stay flexible.
Okay.
The other thing is, part of the discussion of this with Kelly is while we do want to identify funding right now so that she can move forward with the project, there's still a hope that as capital projects wind down, we'll be able to audit sort of where we stand with that and see if there are 2023 capital funds that could supplant some of this money.
Excellent point. Thank you. Okay.
Yep.
Now, are you comfortable?
Yes, I certainly am. So the motion would be to reallocate approved ARPA funds for Hidden Oak storm water improvement to move ahead with the LED lighting project, correct?
Correct.
Okay,
And we'll recommend that to
I will
council.
recommend that to council. Thank you.
Bill, were you able to jot that down?
I got it.
I'll second that. Any further discussion? All right, hearing none. All those in favor of the motion to reallocate $155,000 in the Hidden Oaks stormwater improvements from ARPA funds to the LED streetlight replacement. You know what I'm saying. Thanks, Phil. To recommend that to council, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. Second item under miscellaneous, rescheduling the July 4, 2023 regular finance committee meeting to July 5th, 2023. I move that we do that.
I second that motion.
Any discussion? Hearing none. All those in favor of rescheduling the July 4, 2023 regular finance committee meeting to July 5, 2023, signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the ayes have it. We'll next meet on July 5th. Okay, moving on to the best part of the agenda. It's our budget kickoff, and I'll turn the floor over to Bill.
Thank you. Just getting set up to bring up the slides here. And as I'm doing that, I just want to take the opportunity to introduce for those of you who haven't met him yet. This is Diego Fernandez. Diego has been with the city for just about a year, the position of accountant and budget analyst, and does a lot in the budget process and putting together numbers, working with departments. And you'll be seeing more of Diego as we start budget meetings with the finance committee later this year. Just if you get a chance, say hi to Diego. Does a lot of work for the city, and we're really glad to have him as part of the team.
Great.
With that, I will start taking us through the budget kickoff presentation. And as we started putting this together, we realized there is a lot of material to cover this year. We want to make sure that we have time to go over kind of an overview of what's in the city's budget, what's the context. There's a lot of discussion about all of the things that are coming out of the state budget this year. So we've decided to break this into two parts. This evening, we're going to start with an overview of the city's budget and then talk about some of the context or some of the issues that are underlying the city budget and that we're facing going into this year. The plan is to come back at the next Finance Committee meeting on the 5th and get more in depth on the specific process and timeline and schedule. A major focus of that meeting would be talking about the impact of the state budget, including the additional municipal aid funding that was just signed earlier today, and then talking about other special topics unique to the 2024 budget. We also want to make sure that we allow time for questions. So if you have any questions, either as I'm going through or at the end, please let me know. And if there's particular things that I don't cover tonight that you'd like to make sure we address at the next meeting, please let us know that as well. And Diego and I can work on getting that information ready for you. So starting with the overview, government accounting is divided into funds. And as we talked about a little bit when we were doing the financial statements and had the auditors out here, we have city money divided into several different funds with different purposes. And the main categories of these are laid out in the slide. The first and the most numerous types of funds we have are what's called our governmental funds. And the largest of those is our general fund. That's our primary operating fund. We spend probably the majority of our time in the budget process looking at the general fund. That's where most of our departments and majority of our staff are funded. So that's things like public works, police department, administration, finance. We also have 20 other various governmental funds, some very small, some rather large for specific purposes. And those are funds where there's some type of dedicated revenue that comes in, and those funds are used for that purpose. So one example would be the tourism fund. They get money from hotel room taxes. The tourism portion of those room taxes stay within that fund. All of their expenses and staff are paid out of there, and any balance at the end of the year stays within the tourism fund. We use special revenue funds for grants. Other funds like the library get some support from the general fund, but they also have their own revenues that come in there as well. So that's the first category. Second category of fund is what we call business type funds. And those are the enterprise funds that are accounted and operate somewhat more similar to a business. They generally have a specific function, like we were just discussing stormwater utility, and the primary revenue source is customers or ratepayers that bring in money that we collect, and we set the rates to pay for the maintenance of those assets within the enterprise fund. And then we have some other special funds that we do look at budgets for. We have a community development authority that's involved with downtown projects and redevelopment. We have the Middleton Fire District, which is a separate legal entity, but we do review their budget and our contribution, and we track those. And then we have some other special funds where we track assets for their organizations. I wanted to touch on a few of the major funds that we look at through the budget process and just what the main purpose and funding source is. So again, the general fund, that's most of our operational departments. Primary revenues there are property taxes, various state aids, and then various items where we have charges for service, like for ambulance fees or park fees, aquatic center fees, things like that. Special revenue fund, as I mentioned, those are for specific uses. Revenue sources can vary depending on the type of fund. So it could be a special tax like the hotel room tax, could be grant funds. The ARPA money that we've been talking about, we set up a special revenue fund so that as we get that federal ARPA money in, we account for it in one place. It's used for ARPA approved projects, and that balance stays within the fund. Capital projects funds are used for construction. So when we talk about street projects, major capital equipment vehicle purchases, we budget for that in a capital fund that keeps the capital out of our general fund. And our primary funding source for that general capital has been borrowing, where we will have a capital budget. We issue debt once per year that's used to pay for the projects, and then we pay that back over time through a debt service fund. And that final one on the list here, debt service fund, that is a special fund that is just used to pay for the principal and interest on the debt when we borrow. So kind of the process that we go through is we set our capital projects budget, we set a borrowing target. During the year, we issue debt. And then in future years, we have debt service payments to pay off that debt, and that runs through our debt service fund. Looking at our major business type funds, we have our water and sewer utility. Those are funded by ratepayers as part of our quarterly utility bills. For the water utility, we do have our own municipal water supply. So we have our own wells that we maintain, as well as the distribution pipes and water towers. For the sewer utility, we don't have our own wastewater treatment plant. So we're part of the Madison Metropolitan Sewerage District. Our costs and maintenance in the sewer utility is for collecting all of the sewer through our sewer pipe system and our lift stations and force mains. And then that is sent to Madison Metropolitan Sewage District. And a big part of our cost of that utility are the fees that we pay to MMSD to process the waste for the city. And then we also have enterprise funds set up for the golf course, for stormwater utility, for the airport. This slide looks at all of our funds and the approved budgets for 2023. So when we look at the total expenditures for 2023, it's about $85 million in total expenditures. The general fund is about 25 million of that, but you can see that there are other funds that are sizable as well, with a lot of activity running through there. And the largest single category for this year happens to be TIF districts. And that is a particularly high number this year because we have the Pleasant View Road project included in TIF district number 3. That the city share of that is significant. I think this year it's approximately $14 million, if I'm remembering the number just on that project, plus all the work in the downtown, plus all of the development projects where we get revenue coming in from a development, and then we have our costs associated with that. So there's a lot of activity in our TIF districts. Wanted to call attention to there are only 2 funds out of all of the city's various funds that receive property taxes. That is the general fund, which receives the majority, and then our debt service fund. And then we have TIF increment for the TIF districts, so taxes that are paid within the TIF district that stay within the TIF, and then various other funding sources for all of those different funds. So looking for a minute to our general fund, which ends up being the focus of a lot of our operations and our budget discussions. This slide breaks down the revenue sources for the general fund, and property taxes are by far the largest source of funding. And that's not unusual for municipalities in Wisconsin. There aren't a lot of local revenue options. We're primarily a property tax state, and property taxes represent 62% of our revenues for the 2023 budget. There's various other categories, fines and fees, special assessments, licensing and permitting revenue. All of that is important, but they're much smaller than the property tax. The second largest category is intergovernmental aid, primarily state aids. That's 13% of our budget for this year. And there's various different programs within there, state road aids, which help support the work primarily of the Public Works Department, and our roads is the largest. We've talked a bit about state transit aid, and I'll touch on that a little bit later this evening. That helps pay for our contract with Madison Metro. Shared revenue, which is kind of a general unrestricted aid, that's about 1% of our total general fund budget, about $229,000. So we'll talk a little bit more later tonight and at the next meeting about the changes in the shared revenue program. And there are some very significant changes and additional funding that'll be coming. But it's important to keep in context that shared revenue is starting as a very small percentage of our budget. So even the increases there, it's still going to be a relatively small piece of the overall pie. Looking over at the expenditures for the general fund, the pie chart on the left shows the division by major function. So the largest area of our budget in terms of expenditures is public safety. Police, fire, EMS is the majority of that, and also some building inspection personnel that are classified under public safety. Next largest category is public works, and transit also gets grouped together with public works for the state reporting and for our audit. And then our various other departments, so things like parks and recreation, forestry, conservancy, general government, senior center, various other operational departments. And then the pie chart on the right looks at the expenditures by type. So our largest source of expenditures within the general fund is personnel. It's all the people that run all of the programs and services that we provide. So when we look at wages and benefits, that together is about 58% of the budget. But that transfers category includes some transfers where the general fund is helping to support the library and the youth center. So when you factor all of that in together, it's about 2/3 of our budget roughly that is in people, and then 1/3 that's in other various operating costs. Another fund that we tend to focus on a lot during the budget process is the capital projects fund. So we, in addition to getting department requests from department budget requests for their operational budget, they'll also put together capital requests, and those general capital items that aren't funded by a specific revenue source like water utility or stormwater utility or golf course are generally funded primarily with capital borrowing. Sometimes there'll be additional grants or other revenues, but borrowing is one of the major sources. So one of the main things we look at as part of the budget is what is our annual target for borrowing and how do we allocate that across all of the various projects and needs of the city. This year in 2023, the city borrowed $4.6 million. Of that, $1.5 million was for the city's match on the Pheasant Branch Trails and Bridges reconstruction project, which is about a $2.6 million project in total just for that portion of the work, which excludes some of the initial disaster recovery and the stormwater. This is specifically on kind of reconstructing the creek corridor bridges and trails. So that is a kind of a one-time unusual project that was added in for this year that bumped that total up. In other years, the council most recently has identified $4 million as an annual target. And that's increased somewhat over time. Previously, we'd been at 3, we had a 3.5. I think we had one other year at 4, brought it back down. But that's the most recent direction we have, is targeting about 4 million. And each year we adopt a capital budget for a single year, but we also ask departments for requests for the next 5 years, and we'll put together at least a tentative plan for the next 5 years. That's subject to review and change each year. So the numbers that you're seeing here for 2024 through 2027, that's just that initial allocation. And as part of the process, we will update that, and Finance Committee and Council will have an opportunity to make changes to those years. But it has worked out that generally in recent years, about half of the money from capital borrowing has gone to streets. We've had approximately 500,000 going for our vehicle and capital equipment replacement. And that leaves about $1.5 million for everything else in the city, which when you think of all of the other needs for different departments, for police, EMS, public works, for non-street projects, park and recreation, it's not a lot. And that ends up getting balanced in what the different capital priorities are and trying to identify what can we do and what needs to be held off for the future. And then after we issue the borrowing, that goes to the debt service fund to pay for the principal and interest on the debt. And each year as part of the budget, we also put together and update these projections to look at if we're borrowing at this level, what impact is that projected to have over time? There's a lot of information on this slide. What we're trying to show here with the bars is that is the total amount that we need to pay for principal and interest on debt. So that's our total levy that we're collecting in taxes to make those debt service payments. And it's broken down by color to show the type. So in blue, that's our general capital, the things that we were just looking at that we borrow for on an annual basis. We also have some special debt that was issued for various facilities. We have the Public Works Municipal Operations Center, which is shown in orange, our police station shown in the bar above that, our fire and EMS facilities. And we are getting close in the next few years to where some of that facility debt will drop off. Our fire and EMS facilities will be fully repaid in 2027, followed by our police station in 2029, and then finally the operations center in 2032. What we've been doing as we issue our debt for our annual borrowing is we try to rapidly repay the principal and interest. So legally, we could go out and borrow for a 20-year payback period. In recent years, we've been doing just 8 years, and we try to do level principal and interest payments so that as we're having those current capital needs, we're paying them off quickly, and that'll give us capacity in the future so that if there are new facility needs or other projects that come up, that we have some capacity. And you can see that in the graph that these bars continue to rise about 2 to 3% per year. And then starting in 2028, as that facility debt is repaid, they start to decline. The red line is a projection of just the portion of the tax rate, which is for debt service. And that we saw a decrease from 22 to 23 because we had such a large increase in our tax base in that year. But there too, we've looked at trying to have moderate increases, 2 to 3% per year on average. But we're projecting that after 2027, that would start to decline. So we're trying to build in some future capacity, but those are the types of things that we will look at as we're considering all of the capital projects and the need, kind of balancing how many of those needs can we get through, but still trying to make sure that we're preserving capacity for future debt. I know that's a lot of information. Before I get into the context, are there any just general questions about the city budget or anything that I can help answer at this point?
I had a couple, Bill.
Yeah.
So on slide number 8, I noticed that the expenditure restraint aid is listed as 0%. Is that actually 0% or is it just less than 1%?
It rounds to 0. It's not actually 0, but that has been declining and is a relatively small piece. Part of the formula for the expenditure restraint aid is it looks at the portion of your tax rate that's over $5 per thousand. And our equalized tax rate has been going down. And as that goes down, our amount of expenditure restraint aid goes down. So we are still getting a small amount, but it rounds to 0.
Okay. And then also the amount that we have to put towards debt service every year, is that determined by, by state law, like a formula or percentage of what our debt is?
And it's not set by state law. There are some state law requirements for how much debt we can have outstanding. We can't have more than 5% of our equalized value in general obligation debt. But how we structure the debt, how quickly we pay it, and how we pay amounts each year, that's something that we can set. So when we do the financing, and we've been working with Baird, and they'll put together the financing plan for us, when we issue that debt, we spell out how much we're going to be repaying each year. We've only used fixed rate debt, so we don't have variable debt. We lock in the interest rates. We know that debt service schedule, but we can set that. If we wanted to issue debt over 10 years instead of 8, if we wanted to have more principal on the back end than the front end, we can make those decisions.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'll move into the next section, talking about some of the context that we're facing. So first, looking at the property tax, which of course is the major focus and major operating revenue for the city in our general fund. I think it is helpful as a starting point to take a look at where the city of Middleton is compared to other municipalities. And the way we compare that is we look at what's called equalized tax rates. So we do assessments and revaluations every few years as needed. It's been about every 4 years on average. But the State Department of Revenue provides information that on your tax bill, it's printed as the estimated fair market value. And when you add all of that up for the entire city, they look at what they anticipate properties would be valued if they were at market. So that's what we use for comparing to other municipalities. And when we look at other cities and villages in Dane County with populations over 5,000, Middleton compares very well compared to the tax rates. If we look at our probably closest peer communities of Fitchburg and Sun Prairie that are more similar in terms of population and in the mix of services that they provide, they're both higher, above $6, getting close to $7 per thousand. For this most recent year, on an equalized basis, Middleton was at $5.10 per thousand. The only municipalities in this comparison that were lower were Verona, and they're benefiting from the Epic development and the closure of the TIF district for Epic, and Windsor, which until recently was a town and within the last several years incorporated as a village. So certainly this is just one comparison, but I think it is important to look at in context, especially as it relates to municipal levy limits. Because when levy limits were put in place almost 20 years ago now, everyone was kind of frozen in at what were you collecting in taxes? What was your levy? What was your tax rate at that time? And then it's been adjusted for new construction after that. So some municipalities that had higher taxes, rates and levies before levy limits put in place, they have a higher base and therefore their taxes and tax rates are at a higher level than ours is. So just a couple other thoughts about municipal levy limits. We have one of the most restrictive property tax limits in the country in Wisconsin. They've been in place for nearly 20 years. And since 2011, that has been limited to just the change in net new construction with no adjustment for inflation. And that is really challenging, especially in other parts of the state where there's not as much growth as we're seeing in the Dane County and Madison area. Many communities have less than 1% or near zero growth in their levy each year. We've been fortunate that we do have some net new construction, but especially as more people are coming in, demanding more services, and now we've seen inflation moving up, it gets very challenging to balance the budget with those levy limits in place. Those levy limits only apply to the general fund portion of our levy. So we also, as I'd mentioned, levy property taxes for debt service, and that was carved out of the levy limit law. So we can increase taxes for debt service based on the debt that we issue to make sure that we can pay our obligations, but the operating portion is subject to levy limits. And under current law, there is an adjustment at the closure or when you're subtracting territory from the TIF district that you also get a bump to your levy limit. That's one of the things in the new state legislation that is going to be changing on how that works for new TIF districts. And we'll get into that more in the future, but that is one of the things they made some adjustments to. So if we look at just that net new construction for the city, it varies year to year. We've seen between, we had 1 year several years ago that was near zero. We've seen some up around 3%, but the average over the last few years has been just under 2.5%, about 2.4% on average. And in dollar terms, for the most recent budget for 2023, that was about $320,000 that we were able to increase our levy. And while that's certainly a significant amount, to put it in context, out of a roughly $25 million operating budget, it's about 1.3%. So you can see the challenge and why the city council had decided to go to referendum to help try to support operations and support staffing. When we layer inflation on top of that, this really illustrates the issue that we've seen the last couple of years. When we look at the combination of population growth and inflation as measured by a consumer price index, it's generally been higher than our net new construction, but at least it was relatively close until the last couple of years where we've seen a combination of population growth starting to expand as we've had a lot of multifamily and redevelopment, plus the higher inflation on top of that. Looking at state aids, our next largest revenue in the general fund. This slide looks at some of the trends over the last 5 years. And until this new state budget that's coming up, the story here is that state aids have generally been flat. Shared revenue at one point was a formula-driven system, and the wealthier or the more value your community had, the less you would get in shared revenue. But many years ago, they froze that, and municipalities have just been getting the same amount that they did the prior year. Expenditure restraint program has been going down for City of Middleton. At farther off this chart, we had been up close to 400,000. Over the last 5 years, we've gone from 204,000 to about 110,000. And that's a factor of the way that formula works. That is, our equalized tax rate's been going down, which is a good thing. There's less money coming in through that program. Exempt computer aid has been flat. That was many years ago, the state exempted certain types of equipment and they provided this state aid to try to make up for that. That's been flat. And general transportation aid has fluctuated. Some years it's gone up, some it's gone down, and that's formula driven as well. With the state budget that was, or not the state budget, but there was separate legislation related to municipal aid. And my understanding under that is that there will be supplemental shared revenue that will be provided. For the city of Middleton, the estimates are that that'll be about 541,000. So we would expect to see that as additional shared revenue in 2024, which is a significant increase in the amount of shared revenue, and the first time in probably 20 years that we've seen an increase in shared revenue. It will certainly help with our budget going forward. But as I mentioned, we're looking at 1% of our budget going to 3% of our budget. It certainly will help, but it's still, levy limits are still going to be a driving factor for us, I guess is what I'm trying to say. With that additional aid, there are some restrictions on that, some limitations that it needs to be used for certain types of law enforcement, EMS, fire, public works and transit type expenditures. And then there's a number of other things in those bill that I'll get into in more detail at our future meeting. I wanted to touch on state transit aid because this is something that is new for 2023. So prior to this year, the city, as part of our contracting with Madison Metro, we would pay Madison Metro a net amount, and they would give us an allocation of their state and federal aid. So it would reduce the amount that we were paying to Metro. In working with Metro staff, we determined that it would be better for both the city and for Madison Metro if the city of Middleton were to apply directly to the state of Wisconsin to receive transportation aid directly. We would be eligible for a higher percentage than getting a piece of Madison's allocation. So in putting together the budget for 2023, our payment to Metro, we're now paying on a gross amount, which is about 1.1 million. We estimated that we would be getting about 604,000 in state transit aid for a net local share of about 529,000. We got some really good news earlier this year as we started working with the staff at the State Department of Transportation, and we determined that that state transit aid is actually calculated based on our gross costs, not our net cost. And they had a little bit additional funding, so that percentage went up somewhat. So we actually are going to be receiving a total of 820,000 this year. That reduces our net local share to 309,000 approximately. And that provided the funding that we discussed at a previous meeting to do some of the initial bus stop improvements and shelters and related costs. And we've also had some discussion about creating one of those special revenue funds for transit now that we have this dedicated revenue source. So that would give us an opportunity that if we have years like this where we get additional aid coming in, we can keep that in that fund and use that to pay for future transit costs and help offset the impact on the tax levy. Just going to touch on a few of the other revenue options that are out there. As I mentioned, Wisconsin is a property tax dependent state, so that is definitely our largest source of revenue. In past years, the city has looked at some of the other options that are out there. We've raised the hotel tax to the maximum percentage that's allowed by state law. We annually look at EMS fees. We try to look at other things like that. Some of the other options that are out there, one is the wheel tax, which City of Madison and Dane County are now using. That's a charge that goes on your vehicle registration bill. So you send that into the state. If you live in the city of Madison, a portion of that amount you pay to the state goes to the city of Madison. A portion goes to Dane County. For our residents, a portion goes to Dane County. Municipalities can add that. There's no special state approval or referendum that's required. They're not very popular. There are a handful of municipalities that use them. It's something that we discussed, but there hasn't been a lot of interest in pursuing that in Middleton. Something that's kind of new that's just being used by a few communities is establishing a transportation utility. So that would be something similar to the stormwater utility, except that this would be paying for street maintenance and reconstruction projects, and you would base your fees on estimated trip generation of the property. So the more vehicle trips that are generated by a user, the higher their amount. I've seen this used in some communities where they want to transition away from special assessments and perhaps transition away from using property taxes to support streets and try to do it on a user charge basis. It's not something that's specifically authorized in the state statutes, but it's also something that's not prohibited. It's kind of a new area, and if there's interest in exploring that, we can gather more information. And we've got some case studies of other municipalities that are implementing those. There are special charges for refuse and recycling, which are used by most of our peer communities in Dane County. That's one thing that Middleton has not put in place. So for Middleton, our refuse collection and recycling collection is covered by property taxes and other general revenues. If the city wanted, it could potentially look at establishing fees for recycling. Because of a change in state law several years ago, if we were going to do a fee for refuse, we would need to go to referendum to get the authorization to do that fee. And then the last one I have listed here is increase or maintain the stormwater utility fee. Middleton stormwater utility compared to many other communities in the state is relatively low. Almost 5 years ago, the city went to referendum to temporarily increase the stormwater utility fee to pay for costs related to the flooding and flooding reconstruction. That is set to sunset next year. And so that's a decision for the city of whether we would want to potentially consider going to referendum to maintain some or all of that fee increase for other stormwater purposes, or if we want to continue to keep stormwater utility very limited and borrow for other stormwater projects that can't be funded through the utility. More to come on all of those, but just kind of wanted to mention some of the larger issues that are out there. General fund staffing plan. I'm not going to get into all the detail on this chart tonight, but I just wanted to make the point that as part of the budget process, in addition to doing the 5-year capital plan, we've also asked departments to put together 5-year staffing plans. The most recent update for the 2023 budget, departments had identified 15 full-time equivalent positions spread across various departments in the general fund that they saw as needs within that time period. The referendum passage helped the city fund additional staffing, and that funded 4 positions. But just wanted to make the point that that met some of the most urgent needs, but it does not address all of the staffing concerns that departments have for the future. In addition to number of staff and staffing needs, we also look annually at what we're seeing for personnel cost trends and what we need to be budgeting for to stay competitive for wages and benefits. This is information that Brian Wohlhopter put together and monitors regularly. Our compensation plan for non-union staff looks at what's known as the employment cost index as a target for what we should be setting our cost of living adjustment to stay competitive with the market. That had definitely seen a big spike in 2021, 2022. The most recent number that we saw in March of 2023 for state and local government, that was at 4.7%. We are expecting that by the time we get to September, which is the number we've used for our budget, that will probably come down as some of that impact of 2021 and 2022 is factored out. But just as a very rough estimate, we'd probably be looking somewhere in a 2.5 to 3% target for a cost of living adjustment to try to stay competitive within that index. So I know that was a lot of information tonight, kind of what's next and what's coming up. We'd have the part 2 discussion on July 5th, getting into more details about the changes in the state budget and the municipal funding and trying to highlight some specific policy issues that we anticipate for the 2024 budget. If there's any direction from the committee or the council and the mayor, we would take that and put together that in instructions to department, and we'd be sending out those instructions and the budget forms that first week of July. My recommendation would be that we follow a similar time frame for department budgets and have requests due mid-August, identified August 18th as a potential date. And then from there, what we would do is for the remainder of August and early September, Diego, myself, Brian, and Brian would work with the department heads on reviewing the requests, making sure everything is together, putting together a budget book and starting to work on what a proposed budget could look like. Then we'd be scheduling meetings with the finance committee to review that budget and any proposals from mayor and administration later in September into October. The goal would be by mid-October that the finance committee and council would be comfortable to publish a public hearing notice based on a recommended budget scenario. And then we would publicize a public hearing notice, hold a public hearing in early to mid-November, have council discussions and any amendments to the budget, and then target the second council meeting in November to adopt the budget. And that would give us time to get everything ready, get ready for property taxes that would go out in December. So again, I know that was a lot tonight. If there's any questions I can answer this evening, I'd be happy to. If there's other questions or things that you would like to see for future meetings, that'd be helpful as well. We can make sure we're prepared for you.
Great. Thank you, Bill, for that really thorough part one of your budget kickoff. Any questions for Bill? Comments? None? I have just a few. So Bill, going back to your presentation on page 17, thinking about the bill that I guess Governor Evers just signed it today. So the shared revenue changes will be coming, but that is not really going to change your chart on page 17 very much, correct? I mean,
correct. Yeah. So we don't have our final number for net new construction yet. We won't have that until August. We will put together some estimates working with the city assessor. But I would anticipate that we would still be somewhere in that 2 to probably 2.5% range for net new construction for how much our property taxes can go up. With that being our largest revenue source by far, that's going to be a major constraint on our budget. The additional shared revenue will certainly help and give us more flexibility in this budget than we've had in most, but we'll need to think about that and be strategic, not just for 2024, but also for future years of how we want to prioritize those funds. One other thing to mention about that is that one of the changes out of this funding and presumably in the state budget is going to be that shared revenue in the future will be tied to increases in sales taxes. So that is helpful that in addition to the one-time bump up in the funding of shared revenue, there is a source of funds that will grow over time rather than being static. Still, it's a smaller percentage of our budget, but it will help. But that's certainly something that we'll factor in as we're projecting revenues as we get into the budget.
okay. And then on page 18, the expenditure restraint program. So is this program like an incentive? If we restrain our expenditures, we will get $100,000, or is it just that's what they call this
Yeah.
chunk of money and that's what we get?
Yeah. So it's kind of a strange dynamic between how expenditure restraint and levy limits work. Expenditure restraint was in place before levy limits. And I think it was intended to be an incentive that if you limited the growth of your budget to below a certain percentage, you'd qualify for a state aid payment. That percentage is based on net new construction, which is capped, and inflation. When levy limits were put in place, for most communities, the levy limits are more restrictive than the expenditure restraint program formula. So most communities will qualify for expenditure restraint every year because they have to, because of their levy limits, unless they get a large non-property tax source of revenue that's coming in. So what we've seen over time is more communities are qualifying for expenditure restraint each year. There's a set pool of funding at the state. So as more communities qualify, the amount everybody gets has gone down. And then the formula to determine what share of the pie you get is based on your tax rate. So for communities like Middleton that has a relatively low tax rate compared to our peer municipalities that's been going down because of the growth of our community, our piece has gotten smaller and smaller. Talking to other finance directors around the state, a lot of people have recommended that if you're looking at revising how municipalities are funded, just get rid of the expenditure restraint program and roll the money into shared revenue. But as far as I understand, there have not been any changes to expenditure restraint program to date.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. And then on your next page, page 19, you mentioned the possibility of a special revenue fund for this transit aid. And I know that's something that former Alder Kathy Olson had brought up last year during the budget process. And I hope we can do that for the 2024 budget to create that special revenue fund. And then I had a question about the stormwater utility referendum that passed 5 years ago. And that is, well, first of all, that is a priority identified in the committee of the whole meeting in March from the strategic plan, is to figure out how we can start what do we need to do to get the ability to hire staff on that stormwater utility? Because we do need a stormwater engineer. It's an important infrastructure item. And so I'm wondering, when does the current charge expire officially? I know it's next year, but when during the year? Does anybody know?
I believe that it is the middle of next year. So I think we have 2 quarters that would be collected, the first and second quarter of 2024. And then after that is when it would expire for third quarter of 2024.
Okay, so if we were to go to referendum, that should happen in April if we do not want to have a lapse. And just thinking of the time it took to get our other referendum going, I'm wondering, when will that activity start? What do we as finance or council need to do in order to kick that off? Is that something we should be referring to the Stormwater Utility Board to start discussing, or how does that work? Brian, I see you kind of nodding and shaking your head.
Yeah, I'm noodling in my head. I think that the best way to do it would be as part of the initial budget discussions for the finance committee, to refer that to the stormwater committee for them to take a look at it. That way they could get a policy recommendation approved and back to council before you adopt the 2024 budget, and staff can internally start figuring out what the timeline would be for filings and notices and all those things to be on the ballot for April.
Okay. All right, thank you for that. And then, well, I have other comments, but I'm mindful of the time. So I'll just raise 2. One, I'm totally not a fan of the wheel tax because it's very regressive. I do like the idea of exploring a transportation utility. I think I've mentioned to my colleagues that I attended the League of Wisconsin Municipalities annual conference last October, and there was a great panel discussion on transportation utilities, which are relatively new for Wisconsin. So I wonder if we could get a presentation on that in the future, Bill. And then when we do receive the budget requests, and I'm bringing this up now because I know early July, I think you said, is when the direction will go out to the departments. I know I've talked to Brian about this, so I think this will be the case, but I'm really hoping that we'll see references to the strategic plan, the comprehensive plan, and even our sustainable city plan, which basically consolidate some of the actions in the comp plan, but also our new sustainable purchasing policy. At least acknowledgement that the directors are aware of these and trying to incorporate what council has put in those plans and policies. Any questions come to you folks? Nope. Okay. All right. Thank you for that presentation, Bill. We look forward to part 2 on July 5th. And now may I get a motion to adjourn?
We shall make that motion to adjourn the Finance Commission.
This is Jackson. I second that motion.
All right. We have a motion and a second. All those in favor of adjourning the Finance Committee meeting signify by saying aye. Aye. Any opposed? All right. We stand adjourned. Thank you.